Hi everyone, and welcome to OpenAGI Forum, hosted by GOSIM and Eric from CSDN. And we're here live at GOSIM AI Paris in France. Today we're not just talking about which models are getting stronger or what the latest AI trend is. We want to talk about something deeper as AI starts moving into real enterprise systems and regulated environments and large-scale deployment. What exactly is changing in the way the industry defines trust, responsibility, and readiness? So a lot of things that used to feel secondary, and the role of open ecosystem now seem to be moving to a center of the conversation. So, and our guest today, Michael Berns, has spent many years working close to exactly these questions across AI, regulated industries, open ecosystems, evaluation, and governance. So, Michael, welcome to OpenAGI Forum. It's great to have you here. To begin, would you like to say hello to our audience and briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, Eric. It's a true honor to be at GOSIM and on this podcast. I've always had a deep personal admiration for France. Both of my parents are French teachers, but it's not just for the culture, but also when you think about the last couple of years, for the leadership and the global AI conversation. And looking at our surroundings here at Station F, that is simply staggering. I've spent quite a few years in London, 16 years in total, and Level 39 was once upon a time, the fintech hub and the AI hub with about 250 startups. You've got 1,000 here, so that is very impressive. And yeah, it's really important to understand the scale and the ambition that is very much unmatched, what I can see. And yeah, it feels like this is somewhat a natural continuation of the momentum from last year's AI Action Summit. And when I'm talking about Eclipse Pan-Eval on stage later today, it's kind of my perspective built on these 23 years in international technology, but also these 13 years in terms of the AI space. And initially as a startup mentor, I mentored a number of startups coming into Europe via London, and that really inspired me to take my career in that direction some 13 years ago. And I guess that inspiration and that passion for disruptive technology has not left me, and that's why I'm here, and I like the open source elements and the collaborative nature across borders and cultures very much.
Okay, thank you. So if we look back at AI over the last 2 or 3 years, most of the attention first went to models, AI models capability itself, like scaling, reasoning, like the newest Claude or ChatGPT models, and generation quality. So, but at this stage, things like evaluation, transparency, and documentation, which used to feel more like supporting work, and suddenly seem much more central. So, how do you understand that shift? If you had to judge, is the most part of the AI industry now no longer just the model itself, but the whole layer around trust, proof, and what makes systems usable in the real world?
So for me, it's kind of really moved on from can it work? These are the discussions I had with some of my international clients in these 13 years. But now it's more how do we prove it works? Now where the race has become ever more competitive with new releases every couple of weeks by now, we've come really from a experimental initial phase to what you could say is critical infrastructure or commodity. So we could say while others obsess over individual parameters, I like to focus on an infrastructure of proof. So in Europe, we are looking in terms of the EU AI Act and the date approaching. So it's not just, that transparency is a research goal, but it's like a regulatory license to operate. And therefore, what we are proposing here with Eclipse Pan-Eval is how we turn this abstract trust into something that is more and more verifiable and some neutral data sets, and applying this to get to a higher level of transparency and helping to get a second opinion.
Yeah. So if this layer is weak, if this infra is weak, so where does deployment most often break down in practice for the enterprise?
So from if you could just repeat the question.
If this layer, the infra is weak, so where does deployment must often break down in practice for those companies? So at this moment, what do you see as the real challenge for open ecosystems? And is it mainly that their pace of innovation is being slowed, or that they are being pushed to redefine their value more fundamentally?
Sure. I mean, you've seen it probably in some of the research coming out towards the end of last year, kind of debating some of the innovation. But personally, I don't think the challenge today is like a slowdown innovation. It's a fundamental redefinition of value. So what creates value? How do you measure the impact of AI? And then you can still have the debate with two sides of saying either 85% of AI or Gen AI projects don't achieve a difference in outcome. But based on my experience from Silicon Valley to Singapore, I've really learned that open ecosystems must really move beyond just hosting the code to hosting global standards. That means in a regulated world, our value is providing a neutral ground and some meritocratic governance. So we are shifting from just open code to open trust, right? So you could say the value is trust, or the good old slogan from a German insurer, trust is the beginning of everything, that allows everything else to come and flourish after that.
I see. So as AI moves into real large-scale deployment, so how does the center of competition change?
We've seen this in the news over the last year, of course. The competition kind of is shifting from who has got the most compute to who can be trusted at scale. And in enterprise deployment, specialized models often outperform the general ones at lower cost. And I've seen that in discussion with some of my past clients in a past life, where after a certain client had implemented AI, they were now looking at what are the benefits and how does it cost me and how do I run. So then it became okay, if I want to change that or save costs, where do I need to go to have a safe architecture, the trust, but still operate it at lower cost. So the winners in that scenario will be those who can demonstrate the accuracy and robustness through independent metrics, and the responsibility is now a technical competitive edge, not just marketing afterthought. So that responsible AI, the themes that we've seen occurring before, you can now actually prove it and do it and measure in a way, in a transparent way. So not just philosophize around the topic of responsibility.
Yeah. So looking back across your experience in AI, so regulated industries and now open AI governance, so where do you think the deepest tension now sits between AI, open ecosystem, and the regulatory demands?
I mean, you can take a lot of different takes on this. I've worked a lot of internationally, probably more than 30 countries, and from my perspective, the deepest tension today is between borderless innovation and regional sovereignty. So when you have different ecosystems like Singapore's Launchpad, Level 39, this one here, and many others, I've seen how tech outpaces policy for decades. So that's kind of a reoccurring theme here. But now open governance acts as, you could say, a third place, allowing global research to be evaluated against regional standards. like the EU AI Act, without really sacrificing the technical synchronization.
I see.
So, in short, you could say if we are open to learning from each other and collaborating on a trusted basis, if you give those two things, I think you can have a very positive outcome.
So, a few years ago, as the EU AI Act comes up, it moves closer to real implementations. And what does actual readiness mean for model providers, enterprises, and open ecosystems?
So, for me, I mean, as always with new regimes, it's not just what is written, but how it's being interpreted, and what are the regulatory fines and the rules guarding this. And as we are before that point, I would still say that actual readiness means moving from a demo culture to a documentation culture. So you overestimate the readiness by assuming, you've done all your internal tests and they're sufficient. But when you look at certain articles, in this case, Article 53 and 55, only independent, reproducible evaluation really counts. So you aren't ready until you've got the technical proof that a regulator, not just a user, can verify. So for me, in my background, I worked in investment banking during the financial crisis. After the financial crisis, we had a big movement in Europe to have independent rating systems and to have secondary opinions to validate the first one, and just to have a different view. And I think this is, for me at least, I'm of course biased towards the financial sector, but that is what talks to me in terms of having another independent view and reproducible evaluation.
So I see. So what do you think people are still most likely to overestimate when they say they are ready?
What I mentioned under these articles, it's not kind of what a user thinks, but what a external party like the regulator would think, and whether this would hold up in that regard.
I see. So Europe wants digital sovereignty. But AI also depends on global collaboration. So what do you think is the hardest part of that tension in practice?
Look, I've been away from mainland Europe for 16 years when I worked globally out of London. And I've worked for American firms, I worked for Asian ones. I'm not claiming I have a global perspective on this, but I think I try to come to a neutral place. So for me, the hardest part there is the decoupled synchronization. So that means that technology is global, but the regulation will always be local. So that means sovereignty doesn't mean that you're isolated. It just means that you have to have the agency to govern the tools we use. And then for Eclipse, and therefore also for Eclipse Pan-Eval, it allows a European code base to evolve independently while still participating in a directional innovation with global partners, and to kind of really be open-minded, to learn from each other, and then tailor it to the local markets. Right? The tension could be if you're doing technology with a very much a mindset, I'm only doing this for a local market, and then not realizing that it might have to apply and being approved by other jurisdictions, and so on.
I see. So still look back to your 13 years in history. So what old mistake do you think today's AI industry is most likely to repeat? So what part of the current AI wave feel most similar to past industry cycles you have already seen?
So in my past lives, I've often trained different clients, be it governments or financial services firms, on AI, and I used to talk about those several AI winters, right? When you had back then maybe there wasn't the Gartner hype cycle, but there was a expectation of a certain outcome and it didn't occur, or maybe some of the kind of insights couldn't be replicated in reality. So I'm not saying that we kind of risk repeating those AI winters, but in a way, we could be repeating the proprietary lock-in cycles of the 90s where, let's say, the evaluation standards, if they just remain proprietary, we end up with some walled gardens, right? You could say the platforms, they eventually stifle the innovation that they spark. But I think that open source governance is pretty much the only defense against this evaluation capture by a few dominant players.
See. Okay, I'll just follow up with simple questions out of list. This follow up if the last question is out of list. It's okay. Okay. So do you think, is there another AI winters coming? Will they happen again?
Personally, I mean, you look at the news and you realize how fierce some of this LLM race has become, and you kind of start thinking the valuation for all of them cannot be true. So I see a scenario where some of the upsides might disappoint, or where we see some consolidation. But in terms of humanity making use of AI and using it for good, or to have more efficient outcomes, or for cost savings, and for medicine discovery and so on, I'm not seeing a winter. I think with ChatGPT and other systems, something that people could touch and interact with changed it from being a niche subject, right? In these 13 years, in the early days, when I was talking about AI, even in places like London, it felt like this is still very much niche, and people didn't know how to view this, how to interact. It was an algorithm, you had to build a UI for it. So it was a very different discussion. Now it has arrived in reality. People have seen the benefits to some extent. Benefits needs to be proven and validated in corporates, but I don't think that will go away anymore. It's just that the competition and the race on AGI and those kind of things might move it in a different direction or lead to some consolidation there. But definitely not a winter. When you look at the funding amounts and the valuation amounts these days, then I think even if some of consolidation happens, that will still be 100 times more than 5-10 years ago.
Okay. So if what ultimately determines whether AI enters mainstream systems is no longer just the model itself, but who defines evaluation standards, trust, and the visibility structures, so how does that reshape power in the AI ecosystem?
I mean, when you're the first mover in a market and you can offer something that nobody else has, yes, my early clients asked me, does that work, right? What is the upside? What is the business case? But because the models are converging, or some of the capabilities are getting closer and closer, it comes to also the power kind of shifts to how do you define the test? What are you looking at, right? And there could be cost efficiencies, could be tokens, could be many different ways. But I think people are not just looking for a different business outcome anymore, but a different business outcome with the right amount of tokens, the right amount of investment, and so on. So from an implementation perspective, of course, if you control the threshold of trust, you can control the gate to the market, and that's where the regulatory angle comes in place. By hosting these frameworks in a vendor-neutral foundation, you can democratize this power. So, right, you could say if there are interested parties who are wanting to collaborate, to understand, to commit, then over time they can join some of these initiatives, and that will ensure that these standards are not made by the few, but actually by the many, and then tested, seen, tried out, and implemented across the board, not a single corporate entity.
See. So, over the next 3 to 5 years, what deeper shift in the AI ecosystem do you think matters most? So, what will really shape the next phase?
I mean, of course, I'm a AI optimist. Otherwise, I wouldn't have dedicated all these years to the topic. But there's a move really from a pure language to embodied AI, and you could define this in many different words. But you could say it's definitely multimodal, and it's kind of the next phase is about standardizing the evaluation of you could say sensory-rich systems. So tactile data, robotic reasoning, and kind of looking at how we measure the common sense in these embodied systems. This might be a next technical hurdle, right? So maybe you could call it AGI, but I don't really want to jump on this hype bandwagon. But it's right now AI is interacting with you. It's happening on your machine. But when I look into the future, I see a setup around you where all your technical devices, your environment, your car, everything has a different way of interacting, communicating, and being measured on what is actually providing. So it will be an interesting technical hurdle.
See. So the last question is, from your own perspective, so what is the one thing you most hope people better understand through this conversation, and maybe through your past work?
Mm-hmm. I hope that people understand that trust is really like a technical architecture, not just a marketing slogan. At the Eclipse Foundation, we are not just talking about the ethics. We are actually building an open source blueprint to make it a verifiable reliability. And in my 23 years in the tech industry, on and off, working for tech firms and then later in AI, it's really taught me that transparency is really the only foundation that lasts over time.
I see. So, Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. So, I think one of the best, most important takeaways from this conversation is that next phase of competition in AI may not only be model capability itself, but about the broader ability to build trust and responsibility, shape open ecosystem, and set the standards. So, and thanks to all our listeners for joining us. Please continue following GOSIM Foundation on X, YouTube, Bilibili, and other platforms for more conversation at the frontier of open source and AI. So, Michael, if audience want to follow up your work in the future, where should they follow?
Sure. You can find me on LinkedIn as AI thought leader. That should be quite easy to find Michael Berns there.
Thank you. So, see you next time.